Welcome to the fourth of our videos about the classical and medieval era Britain. So previously we learned that the Anglo-Saxons had established a relatively stable rule of what is now known as England, and they had formed seven distinct kingdoms. 1066 brought about many changes. So until 1066, England was ruled by a king called Edward, and he ruled through a mixture of strict religious, Christian religious practice, making alliances with different leaders around England and in Europe. Edward had quite close connections with the Normans, and the leader of the Normans, Duke William, was a distant cousin. King Edward had no heirs to the throne, and in 1066 he died suddenly, and this created a power vacuum, and that the question was asked, who would rule England after Edward? So there were three people who wanted to rule England. There was Harold. He was the brother-in-law of Edward. He was married to Edward's sister, and he was there when Edward died. So he was naturally the next in line to the throne. He was quite popular with the local kind of government at the time. So he was naturally the next in line to take power. Tostig was the brother of Harold, but he'd been banished to the north by Harold and Edward for failing in his duties a few years earlier. So he was in England, but he was in the north. And I guess he would probably have considered himself to be second in line to the throne after Harold. Duke William, he was the Norman leader. So he stated that Edward had promised him he would rule after Edward died. So if this was true, then really Harold should have supported him instead of taking the crown for himself. However, eventually Harold did take power and he made himself king. He was accepted by the local leaders. He rejected both Tostig and William's claim to power. And this created a situation in which both Tostig and William attacked Harold and tried to take the power to the throne. William's attack, the Norman conquest, was not completely unexpected, but the timing was quite sudden. So even though Harold knew William wanted the power, he did not expect an attack at this time, basically because William would have to sail across the Channel from France to England, and the weather was too poor to sail at that time. However, England was prepared to receive William and his army, and they had a fairly strong army of their own. Harold had a problem, however. William was planning to attack from the south, and at the same time, Tostig was planning an attack from the north. So King Harold decided to fight them both. So Tostig joined with a Norwegian king, a Viking king, and they had a fairly large army. He arrived first from the north, and Harold marched to meet him in battle. Tostig was actually pretty surprised when Harold arrived so quickly. Harold marched with his army really quickly and kind of caught them by surprise, and they had a battle with them. And the English army under Harold defeated Tostig and the Vikings, and Tostig was killed. So the English king had his first victory in battle. Unfortunately, William arrived in the south almost at the same time, but far away from where Harold had just defeated Tostig. So Harold was forced to march again quite quickly with his army to fight William. So Harold arrived quickly, but his army was tired from the battle with Tostig and the march up north. So the battle itself lasted for an entire day at a place called Hastings. So during the battle, Harold was killed, possibly shot through the eye with an arrow, although we're not entirely sure about that. And William was declared the winner, and then he took the crown on Christmas Day, and he was made the new king of England. So like with any invasion previously, there were people who rejected the conquest of William, and the Norman army punished people harshly who rebelled against them. To make themselves feel safe, the Normans started building stone castles and fortifications and replacing local Anglo-Saxon leaders with more friendly Norman leaders. So the legacy of the Norman invasion actually had one of the greatest effects on English society. So for the first time, Europe and England were connected to a king who had connections to both France, in which he was a duke, and England, in which he was now a king. And this meant that England was directly affected and changed by French culture. So we can see these changes in the architecture. We can see more and more stone cathedrals and buildings being made in the same style as in France at the time. So we previously mentioned castles. Now, castles were built to protect important towns and areas, and really, we can still see them in modern times. The castles themselves are incredibly difficult to fight against. So to own a castle means you have the power and the status to basically win most disputes. As well as architecture, the language changed also. English as a language had already been altered and changed due to the use of the Roman Latin, and also the Anglo-Saxon language, which is similar to German. So now, as well as the Latin and Anglo-Saxon, we can now hear French words being introduced as well. And lastly, and most consequently, a new type of society was introduced to the English people. This follows the style in France, and this was called feudalism. So feudalism was a concept that created 4 areas of power: the king, the nobles, the knights, and the peasants. So feudalism works in a hierarchy style based on land ownership. So whoever owns the land, so in this case, the king owns everything. And then the king allows people to rent it from him. They were the nobles. Sometimes he would give it to them. Sometimes he would, they would rent it from him. And underneath those, the knights would lease it from the nobles. And the peasants themselves would actually be the ones to work the land. So it was a kind of system that worked on every part of the hierarchy, contributing to the other. So the peasants worked the land. They were allowed to live on the land and keep part of the farm produce, and they would pay taxes and give the farm produce to the knights. The knights themselves would pay taxes to the nobles, and the nobles would then pay further taxes to the king. As well as this, it was a kind of alliance. So the king could call on local nobles in case of war and battle, and those nobles would use the knights to fight in their war, and the knights would sometimes use the peasants as soldiers to fight as well. So everyone was codependent on everyone else. Okay, so a new type of record-keeping book was created during this time, and this is called the Doomsday Book. And it provides a lot of evidence for what happened during the Norman times and beyond. It even helps keep a record for important events that happened in England well past the Norman times. So the Normans were the last human invader and the last conqueror that England had for some time. To take a country by force never really happened since this time.